Good morning, everyone. We are continuing our Ananda way of life based on these guidelines for the resident members of Ananda's monastic order. So we'll start with a prayer. Let me kind of get myself just so, you know how it is, an inch here, an inch there, move the pillow. Perfect. Now let's pray together. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramahansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel your living presence, that whenever we turn inward, we find you quietly waiting, ready to advise, ready to uplift, ready to share with us your clear courage. Walk with us, surround us with your loving friendship, that we may be able to hold fast to our high ideals, to live according to thy guidance, to find our way home to thee. Om. Peace. Amen. So we are continuing. I hope you're enjoying this. I'm already enjoying this a lot. I have read these guidelines. They were written in 1987. I can't even count the number of times I've read them, talked about them, studied them, tried to understand them, referred to them. But the marvel about the kind of writing that Swami does, which is he receives it. He doesn't reason it out and then write it. He attunes himself to what it is he's trying to accomplish, and then he asks Divine Mother and asks Master to show him how to accomplish it. So when he wrote this, he was trying to write, and he knew he was writing for the centuries. He needed to write the essential qualities that make Ananda what it is. There's many different ways to follow God. There's countless paths. But there's also, as I was saying before, there are these families, and this is what Swami himself says. We live as one expanded family, and it has its own culture. And that's what Swami's trying to tell us. So we're still in the Article 2, which is community life, and it's, let's see how much, we're going to be here for a little while. We have 2 pages more, which is a lot in this little tiny booklet. So here's a very interesting part. Life in a community is, in a sense, like marriage. Yesterday I was comparing the biological family and the spiritual family. He's speaking now in a slightly different way. Life in a community is, in a sense, like marriage. For whatever one member does affects everyone. Whatever hurts one is hurtful to all. And whatever benefits one accrues is to the benefit of all. As one member develops spiritually, all members develop. And as one diminishes, all thereby diminish to some extent also. So he's using the image of marriage because it's freely chosen. It's a decision made by made at a stage of personal maturity. I mean, I'm putting aside, child marriage or arranged marriages, let's just say, and even an arranged marriage has a degree of choice in it. But marriage is a union between adults for a shared common goal and a deep and sacred commitment to facilitate the expansion of each other's consciousness. Now, of course, this is the ideal I'm talking about, but that's what Swamiji is trying to say here. And also, once you step into that reality, you have to make all your decisions, and everything you do in your life has to be in relationship to how it impacts the person to whom you have committed yourself. This is why many sincere spiritual aspirants do not marry, because all of a sudden you don't have the freedom of your own karma anymore. Now your karma is inextricably bound up with the destiny of someone else. You know, in the traditional marriage vow, in sickness and in health, and sickness doesn't mean just physical sickness, it can be in confusion, in doubt, in karmic trials. You know, we will work together. I will cooperate with you always, the way Swami said, I will forgive you always, because our karma is now inextricably entwined. I remember a very dear friend of mine who lived for many years just a beautifully, almost idyllic, solitary life as a devotee. But she wanted a home and a family and children. She met a wonderful man, married him, has been married to him now for decades, and it's all been lovely. I used to visit her in her little nuns' quarters. Nuns, I use that word, but it was self-created on her part. She never joined the monastery because she had this desire. But she lived like a nun until she was married. And then after she was married, and I saw her 6 months later, and she talked about sort of the disruption of her life that this marriage had created, and how she was looking forward to getting back, you know, to that clarity that she had before. I just laughed. I laughed out loud, long and loud. It's over. Absolutely, it's over. You've invited another karmic force into your reality, and you will never be able to close yourself in again. Now, at least on a dim theoretical level, most people who marry have some idea that that's what's coming. And it's a highly desirable state because it breaks down the walls of selfishness. In the case of my friend, she was not at all selfish, so that was not the issue. She just was a little naive. But it breaks down the walls of selfishness and expands our consciousness. It's a very good thing, which is also why we join community. But we join community thinking that I get more of what I want. And oftentimes we're a little shocked when we find ourselves inextricably bound up with people. Another very good friend of mine who came to Ananda, deeply sincere spiritual aspirant, who lasted a few years at Ananda and then went off to live a deeply sincere spiritual life, but in almost pure solitude, because they simply couldn't stand having to involve their life with all those people. Didn't want those people involved in their life, and they didn't particularly want to be involved in everybody else's life. It's a choice, just like marriage is a choice. But once you make that choice, you can't have it both ways. And so we're all just engaged with each other. We don't have the freedom. Now, of course, we have to forgive each other. We have to support each other. And one gets, just as you do in a married life, you get the benefit of that person's love and support and friendship, and they're cheering on the sidelines for you, and their good advice, and they're reflecting back to you. But that kind of neat little individuality, you don't have it anymore. A friend of mine, Durga, had a beautiful dream, which has oft been repeated, but it is exactly what's here. And in her dream, there was a very large circle of Ananda devotees. And I think we were on the green somewhere at Ananda village. And everyone was standing there, and we were, I believe, all holding hands. And, you know, it was a super conscious dream. And in the way of the dream, every so often, one of us would finish our karma, and we would just ascend into the light. And she said what was so notable is that every time someone would ascend, there wouldn't be the slightest sense of envy or jealousy or loss or anything. It would just be a complete joy that someone was rising like that. And there was this total confidence that all of us would have a turn, and she could also feel that each time someone ascended, it's like the whole group was lifted up. And it was a superconscious perception of what is actually true. So, Nayaswami says, speaking of a community life in which we're all intertwined, such a life then cannot reasonably entail a strong affirmation of personal freedom and independence. And this is actually a real cutting edge for a lot of people. Now, this is where partially what's being written actually relates to living in a physical community. But the fact of the matter, what is also written here relates to anyone who does not live in absolute solitude. If you work in a company, if you have a family, if you have a community of any kind, whether or not it is as explicitly spiritual as Ananda is, where we're all working very consciously for the same goal, but any association with people cannot reasonably entail a strong affirmation of personal freedom and independence. And these are the practical compromises that life requires of us. And as devotees, we have to be realistic, and we have to be willing to realize that if we're brought into the situation, this is what we must do. And honestly, community life is frustrating sometimes, because one may have a very clear idea of what's needed, what I want to do, and for some reason may not be able to win the support of the people around you. And we're going to talk more about that in just a moment. But the fundamental premise is we have given up a degree of freedom. And we've done it for the higher good. We've done it consciously for good reason, just like marriage. Just like marriage and having children. I remember, just speaking of having children, but where there cannot be a strong affirmation of personal freedom. There were 3 children in my family. I was the middle. My sister was born, I think, 4 years after I. And my father, who used to like to make jokes about things, but was the soul of dharma and commitment. And in the era that we were born, my mother went to the hospital for each birth. And when my father came to pick up my mother, when she had my sister, the third and last child, as a newborn in her arms, for some reason, I couldn't have been more than 4. I always forget how much younger my sister is than me, but I think it's 4 years. I ask her periodically, even though the number's always the same. I have a picture of this in my mind. I can see my mother carrying that newborn out, and I can see my father very gently helping her into the car. So my father, who always opened the car door for my mother and helped her into the car, whether she was carrying a newborn or not. So he opens the car door, he helps her in, and then he says, he carefully closes the door. So the 2, brother and sister in the back, and we're all excited. We have a mommy and the new baby, and so there's all this happening in the car, and my father shuts the door and walks back. He's going to go around the back of the car, and he got just at the point where he had to turn, and he says, he stood there and contemplated which direction he should go because he was the sole breadwinner, and the responsibility had just increased. He could just keep going away, or he could make the turn and get in the car. And he talked about making the turn and getting into the car. So when you commit yourself to community, you can't always say, but I want, but I want, but I want, because everything we do affects everyone else. Now, when you marry, you trust that the character of the person you love is going to be supportive to your best interests. But it's a decision of trust. When you join a spiritual community, there's a lot of trust involved. So all of this is part of what we have to think about. In any personal decision, Swami is saying, the welfare of all should be taken into account. In every member's search for personal happiness, the happiness of the other members should be considered. Now, the wonderful thing about Swamiji is, you see, that's why he calls these guidelines. This is a principle. This isn't a rule. This doesn't say, well, then you may do this and you may not do that, and this is how you have to go about it. He just says, you have to consider the welfare of all. So then, the actual discernment of what is the other person's welfare, what is a reasonable and appropriate request, when is the time when I have to stand up for what I feel inwardly, how do I approach my brothers and sisters when I need to stand up. I mean, just countless questions, none of which are answered, because each one has to be worked out from the inner spirit. And this is one of the things that makes the Ananda way of life so dynamic, so fresh, so magnetically true. It's also what makes it very, very challenging, because we agree on principle, and then we have to take that principle and then also agree on practical matters. Sometimes it comes easily, sometimes it doesn't. Yesterday I mentioned, some very good friends of mine who didn't speak to me for about 8 years because we had one of those disagreements. And then after a while, it just was not as important as our friendship. But in the moment, it divided us for a while, because we just couldn't come to a practical resolution, and each side had to do what they felt was right. But the meaningful point is we never quit each other in our hearts. We just found that there was an obstacle for a while to expressing that. There you have it. Okay. Ananda members should therefore work together always in a spirit of unity, and never with selfishness or pride. Oh, yeah, that's easy to say. Am I just being prideful? Am I just being selfish? When does the harmony of the group outweigh the fact that on this particular issue I would make a different decision? And let me just see how this evolves. I guess I have other things to say, but I think they come later. They should endeavor to help one another on every level, physically, mentally, and spiritually, which means we can't just sort of disregard the practical side of life and just say, well, on the spiritual level it's fine, so I'm going to go ahead and take your belongings because I think they belong to me. No. I'm going to take my advantage because I'm in the position to do so, and it's just your karma. No, physically, mentally, spiritually. So Swamiji's telling us we have to learn to behave on every level. And again, we take this for granted. I take this for granted, having grown up spiritually and been trained by Swami. But it's not the way every ashram works. Some ashrams, some spiritual paths, you just deal with the spiritual level and all the rest of it is your problem. But Swami's telling us, no, we have to help each other on every level. The help they offer, moreover, should never be imposed. It should be tendered with respect and love, rather in full awareness that a sincere offer confers no obligation. Now, of course, in many ashrams, you're under obedience. You have to do it. You have a clear-cut hierarchy, and whoever is above you gets to tell you what to do. Friends of mine, living in, even nowadays, in such a setting, well, he said to me that it was a matter of obedience and I had to do it. Swamiji talks about a time when he was compelled, he had the copy of the autobiography, which was the original one that he'd gotten from the bookstore, and under obedience, he was compelled to give it away to a guest. And Swami said it just wasn't right. If we'd waited 24 hours, we could have gotten another copy of the book. But under obedience, he was compelled to give it away. And it's just, Swami always felt that, except for the Guru, no one should have that authority over you. Master actually said to discipline your will to a Master said, to discipline your will to a God-realized person strengthens your will. But it often weakens your will to have to discipline yourself to others who do not have that degree of wisdom. Now, he says, however, love, respect. There always has to be love and respect. He says, the help we offer should never be imposed. And he just makes that categorically. The help we offer should never be imposed. He doesn't say except for persons in this position, persons in that position. That also requires, you see, that we never have we never get to surrender responsibility for our own lives. We can never say, well, they made me do it and it's not my karma anymore. No, it's always ours. We're always responsible. And those who are in positions of influence, which is really, we all have influence upon each other, should be offered with respect and love. And this is, again, if you're not living in community, but you're living in family, this is also how one should behave. Now, many times in families, especially in some cultures, you know, father has absolute authority. A friend of mine who's from India has done many things in his life that were not exactly what his family wanted. But most of the time it was his mother who was asserting a certain desire, and he was able to not have to go along with what she was suggesting. But then he was telling me of another spiritual brother of ours who was going to have to defy his father. And my friend was explaining to me that in India you can defy your mother and it's not good, but you simply don't defy your father. And I thought, how unfortunate, because often your father is wrong, because he may be a very good man, but he might not know who you are or what you need. And also, especially nowadays, so much shifts from generation to generation that, you know, what was perfectly true is simply not true anymore. It's very difficult times right now. And anyway, and when Swami wrote The Time Tunnel, which is a children's fiction book, but it's a true story. It's just that the circumstances are fictional. But one of the things he just puts in there, because this character travels back and forth in time, and he goes forward in time to a much higher age, and he falls in love and decides to stay in that higher age. And he has no family because he's not even from that time. But the tradition in that age is that when a couple marries, they move into the home of the bride instead of the groom, of the wife instead of the husband. And Swami just has a couple of paragraphs in there about how he thinks this is a better way to do it. He said, because when the bride moves into the boy's house, his mother is often very possessive of her son and a little jealous of the wife. And it's often very hard on the wife. He said, but when the son moves in to the girl's house, the mother is more likely to just be able to embrace the son and not be as jealous, because it's because the son has a nobility and the father can welcome him as a companion, and the husband gets to be a man in a house where he was never a boy. And all of that, Swami thought, was much more wholesome. You know, the multi-generational also has both advantages and disadvantages, because for lots of different reasons, but it's very interesting. But help they offer should never be imposed. It should be tendered with respect and love, with the full awareness that a sincere offer confers no obligation. Now, this is just advice for us as human beings, how to get along with anyone. Your own children, your own parents, your Guru Bhais, your spouse. Then Swami's, again, this is specific to an Ananda life in community, or in Sangha, if you're part of a congregation. No major decision in any member's life should be made without consulting his larger spiritual family, or an appointed representative or group of representatives of that family. In other words, once again, not a strong affirmation of loyalty, of independence. But I need your advice. I'm thinking of taking this job. I'm thinking of starting this business. I have a desire to work more in this way. I'm attracted to this woman or this man, and, you know, does it does it seem to you that this would be a beneficial marriage for me? Now, of course, you have to trust the people you're talking to. So all of this is based on relationship. All of this is based not on you're in a position of authority there, therefore you tell me what to do, but I know you to have my best interest at heart, and I know that you have the welfare of the whole and perhaps a perspective I don't have. But even then, it's offered with love and respect, and it's never imposed. See, this is the dual responsibility. It's not just that I surrender my will, it's that my cooperation is profoundly respected. I often say to people, if you don't have somebody in your life whose wisdom you respect and whose objectivity you can trust, it would be very wise to try to find such a person and to cultivate a friendship before you have an emergency that has to be solved, so that by the time you really need help in resolving an issue, there'll be a flow of energy. You won't have to start when everything is on the line. Now Swami says, loyalty, Paramhansa Yogananda often said, is the first law of God. And this is I'm only going to be able to introduce this, and I'm really going to be able to talk about it more. This is part of the reason Master said loyalty is the first law of God, is because loyalty is the quality of the first chakra. And it's not loyalty like you should be loyal to me. It's not that kind of loyalty only. It eventually can manifest that way. But the first chakra is the earth chakra, and the root chakra. It is where we plant ourselves according to the truths and the values by which we're going to live. And in the classes about the chakras, which is, of course, a huge subject in itself, the way Swami has us work with these, which is really brilliant and practical, is that each of the chakras represents a necessary quality to have a balanced, forward-moving, uplifted life. And so the lower chakras, when the energy is misused, can draw our energy away from our higher aspiration. But when the chakra is working in the way it's supposed to work, it contributes its unique understanding to give us a balanced personality and a balanced set of understandings that we can move through the world. So the first chakra, which is the beginning point, being loyalty, means that we are clear about the principles that guide our lives, and we have the willpower to live by them. That we're not going to be just blown away every time some little contrary desire comes. I mean, this is extremely easy to say, but over and over again in our spiritual lives, the question of what do I mold my life around, and how do I discriminate to make sure that I'm following that? The word that I've found to be the most gratifying for me when I talk about Swami Kriyananda and when I talk about the effect that he had on me from the moment that I met him is pole star. And pole star is a word that's used in many spiritual traditions because the image is so perfect. The pole star is the fixed point of reference in the heavens, which is the starting point for all our decisions. That's how we navigate. We can navigate our way through the dark of night and the formless sea, because the pole star tells me where I am and whether I'm going in the direction that I want to go or whether I veered off course. And what we have to be loyal to is the pole star of the values that we've embraced in our life. And so I've been using the image of marriage. One makes a commitment, And, it's not always that that's a commitment unto death. I mean, I have to say that because times are so changing. That's the way things are. In this kind of transition time, we live many incarnations through one physical incarnation. As Swami said, a lifelong marriage is not necessarily a spiritual victory. That's a whole different discussion, but I'm using the image here, which is, it becomes a decision-making, a fixed point of reference. Committing ourselves to the spiritual family, committing ourselves to the community becomes a fixed point of reference. And we need to have the power to set our minds and be loyal to what we've decided. And that's the earth chakra. That's the first stage of spiritual life, is to be steadfast in our commitment. Now, that's going to lead to a lot of other things, which we will talk about tomorrow. God bless you, my friends.